the actual negotiation process, there are some very good things in Senate Bill 5 for appointing authorities. One of the major things is Senate Bill 5, in terms of what you're actually negotiating. There are two types of things when you're negotiating a labor contract. There are things that you are permitted to negotiate, and there are things that you're required to negotiate. Prior to Senate Bill 5, there was typically an interpretation throughout the state of the previous collective bargaining provisions that said, essentially, if in the past you negotiated a permissive topic in your collective bargaining agreement, it now becomes mandatory in all future agreements. Senate Bill 5 gets rid of that and says, these are the list of things that are mandatory for you to negotiate. They are mandatory from here forward. These are the things that are permissive for you to negotiate. They are permissive from here forward. And just because you negotiated it in this contract does not make it mandatory that you negotiate it in the future. And that's a huge, I think, tool for appointing authorities. And I think that that's one of the things that, if you would have asked most people involved with this, that represent appointing authorities, that was one of the huge problems under pre-Senate Bill 5 collective bargaining that they wanted to get rid of, which was, we don't want to have to necessarily constantly renegotiate, these provisions just because we negotiated them once. You can opt to do so, but you're not required to do so. The other changes to the process include actually redefining potentially the potential composition of collective bargaining units. And I don't know necessarily how this, because we have a number of different collective bargaining units in the county, I don't know necessarily how this directly applies to the bargaining units we have without studying each one individually. But particularly this is particularly true for safety forces, and I guess the jail contracts would be primarily the ones you would look at here. And that is that the way the prior collective bargaining agreement defined essentially management or supervisory positions, it excluded very little. Essentially, like your chief and maybe your chief deputy were excluded, but for the rest of your employees, they could conceivably be all in one collective bargaining unit. And the potential danger of that is that when you have management, when you're negotiating the collective bargaining agreement that applies to both them and to the rest of the employees, that there's no longer necessarily a give and take division. SB5 gives a broader definition of the supervisory employees and allows you essentially to divide them out from existing bargaining units. Now the problem pragmatically with it is that it's going to be a fact-based test based on the duties, not a position title. So again, if you go to try to exclude somebody, you can count on having litigation to determine whether or not they're appropriately to be excluded. But it does give you that availability, and this is something I think that affects other places more than I think it affects us, because I know currently we do have a number of different bargaining units, for example, out of the jail, and so I don't know how much crossover there actually is. But again, it would be something that you could look at under the Senate Bill 5 and potentially divide out. There's also a new timeline under SB5. Under SB5, the process now begins 105 days prior to the expiration of the existing CBA. And then after 75 days prior to the expiration, either party may request that SERB intervene in the negotiations. 70 days prior to the expiration, SERB will appoint a mediator to hear both sides and see if they can come up with a compromise. After the appointment of the mediator, either side may request a fact finder. This was true before, but the fact finder now like I said, the timeline for that is now shortened. If there's no agreement 45 days before the expiration, the CERB will appoint that fact finder. The fact finder then has 14 days to issue the report, and the legislative body, which would be you guys, then has 15 days after that report to accept or reject the fact finder's findings. 5 days after the CBA expires, or 5 days after the publication, the chief executive, or the appointing authority in this case, and the union must submit their last best offers to you guys. The commissioners then have 15 days to take action. The contract will be binding for 3 years. If you take no action, then management's offer is automatically accepted, and it becomes binding for 3 years. Now this process replaces the arbitration process. Before, if there was an impasse after the fact finder, the case would go to an arbiter. And the arbiter had the option of choosing management's proposal or labor's proposal. They didn't have a choice of picking anything in between. And this was one of the fundamental problems with pre-Senate Bill 5 collective bargaining, was that it was an all or nothing approach when you got to arbitration. You either got,
this doesn't sound like the legislative body has the choice.
That's what I'm explaining. Exactly. No. Now, rather than fixing what was the fundamental problem of the final deciding authority doesn't have the ability to compromise, they had to choose A or B, they now get rid of the arbiter, but they put you guys in that same role. You now have to choose management proposal or labor proposal. You don't have the option of picking something in the middle or saying none of the above. Now, where that particularly impacts boards and county commissioners is that, as you know, we have a number of appointing authorities in the county. I mean, you guys directly control the labor negotiations for those that fall under your appointing authority, but you don't under other appointing authorities. So, for example, the sheriff is his own appointing authority, and he controls the terms and conditions of what is in his proposal. Now, under this provision, you as the Board of Commissioners, for example, would be, in that situation, in the position of choosing sheriff's proposal or the labor proposal. You can't say, I don't like either one, send it back to the drawing board, because if you don't do anything, if you don't choose one of the two, the sheriff's proposal, by way of the illustration, takes effect, and it takes effect for 3 years. So you don't have the ability to say, I don't like either one, go back to the drawing board. You don't have the ability to say, we like this and this, but not this. We're going to pick and choose, or to compromise them. You have to choose one or the other. Now, there are some additional interesting
question.
Sure.
I mean, this is going to tie into something you're going to say later, I think. But if the commissioners started a centralized human resources department and then put a negotiator for the unions and compelled all of the departments to participate, then they would have control over the bargaining.
Yes and no.
Okay.
They would have control in the sense that they would have one person doing all of the negotiations who answers to the commissioners. The terms and conditions are still set by the independent appointing authorities, but at least the commissioners would know along the way where they stand. Whereas under the current system, the appointing authorities can hire their own people, and the commissioners may not find out until the proposal's sitting on the table what's contained in the proposal. So again, they might have indirect ability to essentially influence the appointing authority throughout the process. And say, hey, I know you're talking about putting this on the table. You need to look at this in the big picture, and here's what we're dealing with as commissioners, and so you would have the potentially more direct knowledge and direct input if you went that. But the terms, the new provision makes it clear that the terms and conditions are still set by the appointing authority. All right. So let's assume that we're at that stage now where the two contracts are sitting in front of you, and you decide you do want to take action and not merely, just ride out and wait for management's offer to become effective. The decision you make has to be made in public. It cannot be made in an executive session. And there are some interesting provisions in that. The law now requires, our auditor left us, because this is where it gets kind of onerous on him. The law now requires that our auditor, within, I believe, 3 days, determine which provision, when you total up all the provisions, which contract costs the county more money. And he's got 3 days to do this, which some of these provisions can be very detailed, and the actuarial analysis difficult. So now that the auditor's got 3 days to determine which one costs the county more money, based on all the terms and conditions and everything, not just salary, wages, and so forth. He then is to provide that information to you. And again, within your 15 days, you have to decide, which by the way will include these 3 days. So you're really got to 12 days. You now have to decide which of these two proposals to accept. Now, if you pick the one that the auditor says costs more money, and the auditor determines that the county can't afford that, it's subject to referendum by the voters. Either side can place it on the ballot, or a public citizen can place it on the ballot. Now, what's interesting here is the law doesn't say what happens if the auditor determines that the county can't afford either proposal. If you pick, I guess if you can't afford either one and you pick the least expensive, it still becomes effective.